So a warm welcome, everybody. I'm Erin Michalak. I'm the leader and founder of BD, and I am super excited to welcome you all today to this very special Talk BD event with Louise Dwerryhouse. You may know of Louise's work with us at BD. She's been a wonderful contributor to our blog. She's a very elegant writer and has described through her writing her journey with bipolar disorder. But this is the first time we've actually done a a verbal session together, and so I'm really excited for the time that we have. One of the things we're going to do is actually take some questions that we've received from our different social media platforms and websites through BD. But we'll begin with some bigger picture stuff. And I just want to start with giving you a warm welcome today, Louise.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Why don't we start with the big picture? I'd love to hear in your own voice about your journey with bipolar disorder and how you were diagnosed and some of the details of that experience for you.
Okay, I'll start with saying that I've had bipolar 1 disorder for 30 years, and I've been living well with the bipolar disorder for 10 or 11 years. And in case the listener is interested, I've had 8 hospitalizations, 3 for full-blown mania, and then 5 for depression. So my diagnosis, I know that diagnosis of bipolar disorder is really traumatic for some people. For everybody, it's traumatic. You're told you have a serious mental illness that cannot be cured. But that wasn't my experience. I was really optimistic at the time of diagnosis, which I think is probably quite rare. I'd been living with unipolar depression for 4 years straight without a break. And I had read I'd found a book from my library on mental illness, and I'd read a chapter on depression. And yet there was also a chapter on bipolar depression or bipolar disorder. And I read that chapter just out of curiosity. It was 1991, and bipolar disorder was not in the news like it is now. I didn't know anything about it. I don't even know why I read the chapter, but it stuck with me. And what stuck with me was that the symptoms of depression that I was experiencing were basically diametrically opposed to what the symptoms in mania were. And I thought, wow, to have this illness, it sounded like it was fabulous compared to the depression I'd been experiencing. Little did I know then that it wouldn't be. And so I was hospitalized. I called my GP and I told her that I had bipolar disorder, because I realized that that's what I had when I went into a full-blown manic episode. And she agreed with me after talking to me on the phone, and I was hospitalized that day. Now, I was so optimistic because this diagnosis felt like it fit. I can't explain it. I could look back, I was 35, and I could look back to my 20s and even my late teens, and I could see that I had many periods of hypomania. And I also had the rages, which started at about the age of 18 or 19, which were really uncharacteristic of me at that time. And so it just fit. So I felt that I had the correct diagnosis. They took me off all my antidepressants. I was put on mood stabilizers. And so I felt that I have the correct diagnosis. I have the correct medication. I will be 100% controlled. They kept telling me it couldn't be cured, but I thought I was really naive. I thought if I had all these things were lining up, I would be 100% controlled. And that turned out not to be the case. It was the exact opposite. So that hospitalization was about 2.5 months. And when I returned home, I rapid cycled for 9 or 10 months. And I was actually rapid cycling during the course of a day. So for example, I would wake up depressed, and then by 11:30 at night, I was laughing hysterically by myself at my jokes and my funny thoughts. And that's actually called ultra rapid cycling. Right. I read recently. And I had that for 9 months. And I remember at the absolute depths of it, I remember thinking, I'd been laughing crazily. And I actually called myself crazy. I actually used that adjective to describe myself. It was really a low point. And I was worried if I would ever get well. I would worry if I would need to be institutionalized. I was worried where I would be in 10 years from now. And so all the optimism that I had at the time of diagnosis disappeared. I realized that I was in for the long haul. This was a very serious illness, and perhaps it couldn't be completely controlled or at least at that point in my life, it wasn't being completely controlled.
Mm.
So after that, I guess I should talk about the depressions. I had many depressions. I've had many more depressions than manias over the years. And I had a few minor depressions after that, but about 3 or 4 years later, I had a profound depression, and it was actually suicidal. And I didn't attempt a suicide, but I had a list. I remember I had a list that I had to go through to carry out my plan. Mm-hmm. And on the list, there was a purchase that I had to make, and I had made that purchase. Mm. So I was really very close to trying to take my life, and I was hospitalized again for a very lengthy hospitalization. I think it was 2 months. Mm. And my psychiatrist at the time told me that my children would be devastated if I were to commit suicide. They were just young children at the time, under 10. And, it was really shocking for him to tell me that. It didn't even occur to me that my children would be devastated. I think that for me, depression is not a considerate state. I think that I was so consumed by my grief and my pain and so focused inward, I didn't have the capacity to think about anybody else. But when he said that, I knew that I never wanted to have suicidal ideation again. I just said, I told myself, no matter how bad it gets, I don't want to have that again. And the only way I could think of doing that was to call my psychiatrist right from the start, when I started to feel a little bit depressed, rather than waiting. I had waited months. I'd had that profound depression for maybe 10 months before I was hospitalized.
Wow.
And so that was the first time I was kind of proactive. It was kind of a turning point with me. And so I went on to have 4 further hospitalizations for depression. So I couldn't stop it from happening. But because I nipped it in the bud, I did not have that suicidal ideation anymore. And then with the manias, well, what can I say? I systematically destroyed my marriage. I really did. I was abusive verbally and physically, and I don't know, my marriage just couldn't sustain that. And then also I'd have the years of depression, the severe depression. So it was very hard on my then spouse. Mm-hmm. And so, but gradually, and this is getting into the second decade. So the first 5 years were hell after diagnosis. The first 10 were very bad. And so now I'm into the second decade, and I started to feel more stable. And what happened is that my mood episodes became further apart and less severe. Mm-hmm. And I've had people tell me this, the same thing as they age with the disorder, that sometimes can happen. And I was really fortunate that happened. I have to say, I didn't do anything to promote it. It just happened over time. But then once I realized that I was stable, and it took me probably a good year or a year and a half to realize that the mood swings seemed not to be coming anymore. I was just stable. That's when I became really proactive. I decided I wanted to maintain that stability. And so I had to go about finding out how I could maintain that stability. And so I did a few things. I started taking a lot of courses. For the listeners out there, depends where you live, but where I was living, there were courses. So I started to take many courses. I took anger management. I took anger management twice. That's how bad my rages were. I took mindfulness. I took a binge eating course because I had problems with binge eating. There's so many mindfulness. There's so many courses out there. And so that was the first thing I did to educate myself. And I started to feel I had a bit more control over my life because I had been reacting all the time. I hadn't been proactive. And what else did I do? I started to practice sleep hygiene. And sleep hygiene has many components, but the one that's most important to me is getting up 7 days a week at the same time. Mm-hmm. And it has to be 7 days a week because you have to set your internal clock.
Including the weekends, right?
Even on the weekends, I'm up at 7 without an alarm. Uh-huh. And I found that made a huge difference. Structure is very important in my life.
Do you go to sleep at the same time when you can as well? Yeah.
Yeah, when I can. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But even when I go to bed later, I still get up at my 7 o'clock. It's just ingrained. Mm-hmm. So I started to practice that, and that made a huge difference. And I kept all my psychiatric appointments. I think that they're really important because I thought for years that the psychiatrist just listened to me and prescribed medication, and it didn't occur to me that they observed me. And it was only once when I went in to see a psychiatrist, and I wasn't in his office more than 1 second, and he said, "You're high." I
Mm.
didn't say anything. I just walked into the office.
Mhm.
And so that's when I realized that you need to see a psychiatrist so they can observe you. They don't just listen to what's going on in your life. And I
What
also,
would they have picked up on that you hadn't picked up on at that point? Can you remember?
oh, when I walked into the office,
Yeah.
it was my whole demeanor. I think I
Mm.
just gave him a look.
Slightly sassy look.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that was enough. Yeah,
Yeah.
half a second. Um, so then I started to, and then I also told myself that I would never tamper with my medications without the consent of my psychiatrist. And this was a big one. I think that I know that my psychiatrist has 13 years post-secondary education in the field, and I have none. So I really see my psychiatrist as the expert. That's not to say that I don't negotiate with him. If I
Mhm.
have a drug that I'm on and I have side effects that I don't like, we negotiate it. We might decrease it, try another thing, what have you, but I never touch it on my own. I've had friends that have with disastrous results to stop or reduce the medication on their own. And
Mhm.
then finally, I started to eat better because I'd been a big binge eater, and I started to exercise. Exercise is another thing that's
Mm.
structure in my life. And these
Mhm.
are all simple. When you listen to them, they're all really simple tools. For complex illness, it's strange that the tools are so simple, but they work.
Well, it's hard to enact the simple ones sometimes as well. It sounds simple to say get up at the same time every day and incorporate routine exercise into your daily life, but those behavioral interventions actually can take a lot of work to stay consistent and to implement in your life. So they may be simple, but executing them is hard work a lot of the time too. And not always the most fun thing either. You know, you might be having fun at night and not want to go to bed at your routine time.
It does happen. But no, I think I'm so fearful of those days coming back where I had great instability that it doesn't seem to be a hardship uh,
Uh-huh.
at this point in my life. I would hate to go back to that time. I recently had a 4-month relapse just because of a medication change under the supervision of my psychiatrist, and I didn't like it. I didn't want to go
Mm.
back to that place. So it works for me.
So is that something that you worked on as part of your sort of psychological work, thinking about the pros and cons of behaviors that you can do for self-care and risk of relapse? Sometimes people do that on paper. They'll have 2 pieces of paper about pros and cons of sleep hygiene or keeping an exercise routine or taking medications versus, you know, the consequences of getting back into an episode again. Is that something you ever sort of did formally, or is it just, it sounds like something that certainly is top of mind for you now?
No, it was never formally. I never had any help with it. I
Mhm.
just went about systematically reading as much as I could,
Mm.
and then the pros so outweighed the cons that it just made sense to get up every day
Mhm.
at the same
Mhm.
time, or to take my medication as prescribed. All these things are relatively simple in the grand scheme of things. But
Mhm.
I didn't do it. It wasn't a formal process. It was organic. It developed over time.
There's this strong narrative thread in your story. So you've had a very complicated, complex experience with bipolar disorder. If I was flabbergasted to hear that you experienced rapid cycling for 9 months, that must have been an awful, exhausting period to go through. But I'm really interested to hear about how the role of control played out in your story, because you talked initially about receiving a diagnosis, and it sounded to me like you were going through a period of feeling like suddenly you had a different lens on your the way you were of bipolar disorder, and that made sense, and maybe you had more of a sense of control, but then you lost that again in sort of, you know, your second decade with the condition. I just wonder, where are you now in terms of the amount of control you feel you have over your bipolar disorder?
I feel I have enormous control, but I never lose sight of the fact that I could lose it very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have enormous control. I don't. It's reached the point where I don't really think about it, which is probably the best thing that I could say. It's not on my radar. I feel I'm peace with it, and I just get up and do my day.
Mm. that must be a nice alternative to some of the previous. It must be a nice place to be at this point in your life.
Well, it is. I got to say, I'm really contented these days with the bipolar disorder. I feel like I've gone on this really long journey, and mostly it was a solitary journey. And I've come out the other side. I've reached my destination. And that feels good when anyone does that in any walk of life. And that's where I have this great contentment these days. It's not to say I don't have my problems. I have generalized anxiety, which is that's the forerunner now. It's taken over the bipolar disorder because I have no more episodes or mood swings. If I didn't have the GAD, I would be living a really normal life like everybody else. But the GAD, I find, really infringes on my happiness and my ability to cope sometimes.
How does that look for you, Louise? How does that present for you?
Well, it's all consuming, actually. It's on every level of my life. I tell people I have anxiety and they might say, well, I have it too. But I mean, I have anxiety to the point where if I'm in a mall and I'm afraid to go down the escalator, because if I do, my legs shake and I'm afraid to get off the escalator, I'll only shop on the level that even if I want to buy something on the lower level, I'm afraid to go in the stairwell, because one time many years ago, I got stuck in a stairwell. I went down it and it was locked, and I went back up and it was locked, and I panicked. So it's on every single level. It's when I get on the bus. It's sometimes when I have to step outside, and I'm always pushing myself, always. So I find it's a really difficult disorder to have.
Mm. Yeah, sometimes anxiety feels so bad, it feels like it's going to eat you alive, doesn't it? It's a very uncomfortable, severe anxiety is, it could be excruciating to experience.
It is excruciating sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Are there lessons that you learned with your bipolar disorder that you're trying to carry over to coping, dealing with your generalized anxiety disorder?
I would say mindfulness is the biggest one, just to try and be in the present, just try and live in the present, just not focus about the fear that's down the road.
Mm-hmm.
So mindfulness comes into play. I would say that's pretty much it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's and just try to stand up to it. I think I would have agoraphobia if I let it go
Mm-hmm.
to right to the end. I'm pretty sure that that's my disposition, or that's the level of which I have it, or how I can let it affect me. So every day is a challenge to get out there.
That sounds like a lot of hard work. I take my hat off to you for that constant attention that piece of your life needs at this point.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe your quality of life overall, 30 years on from your diagnosis of bipolar disorder?
I think I'm really contented. I've done a lot of work on gratitude, and gratitude has been linked to happiness. And there were points in my life when, in the earlier days, when I felt that I had nothing to be grateful for. There was a point in my life when my children had gone to live with my ex-husband, and it was a plane ride away, and I couldn't afford to pay for the plane ride frequently. So I only saw them once every 3 or 4 months, and they were under 10. And so I find that I find like I have so much contentment because of what I've been through.
I'm quite interested. So after 30 years of this rich experience that you've had, let's put you in a time machine and let's send you back so that you're that young woman who just received that diagnosis of bipolar disorder for the first time. What would you tell your younger self, having had all of that experience under your belt at this point of your life?
The very first thing I would tell myself is just hang in there. Because it is a long ride for a lot of people. I find that the younger people coming up, there seems to be drugs that I haven't been given, and people become well from the outset. But if you're someone like me who is very unstable for very many years, I find that just hang in there, and it's like the slogan that they have for the
LGBTQ2 is one option.
Okay.
Yeah.
They've got this great slogan that says it will get better. And I think it does. I think there's a few things that I would tell myself. I would tell myself to take hypomania very seriously. And I know that a lot of people think it's an innocuous state, but in my case, it's a precursor to mania.
Mm-hmm.
And I never want to be manic again. And so the way I can stop the mania from taking hold is to nip the hypomania in the bud, because it's always been a precursor to mania. So I would tell myself that. And again, the way I do that is contacting a psychiatrist as soon as I have the first stirrings of hypomania. And that way we can change the medication and I won't develop mania. Because when I read stories by people, all the grief and pain and suffering that they seem to be feeling always seems to be a result of the manic state. I myself haven't offended anybody when I've been severely depressed. I haven't offended people when I've had my hypomania, but I sure have done my fair share of offending and hurting people, loved ones, people in my orbit, when I've had the mania. So what I
You
do,
mentioned those your special early warning signs. I'd love to know what those are for you. How do you know when hypomania is just starting to spark up for you?
always the first one, and I think this is universal for everyone, is that sense of well-being. It's very subtle. I'm in the car, the top is down, the radio's blaring, and I'm singing. And but you know that can happen to you. I mean, everybody has a great day like that. I know. I drive. I look around, and people are in the car singing to the radios, and they don't all have bipolar disorder. So my second sign is when I call the psychiatrist, and I'm very fortunate. I have a second sign. I've had some friends who have bipolar 1 disorder who say they've never had hypomania that precedes it. They just developed mania. I'm very fortunate that I have this sign, and mine is hypersexuality. And I, without fail, I get that. That's my second symptom. And I just know I don't have that level of libido, and I'm not promiscuous unless I'm hypomanic.
Right.
And so when I start to get that high level of libido and I start to become promiscuous, that's when I call the psychiatrist. We stop the hypomania from progressing, and therefore I never have gotten the full-blown mania again. And I haven't had full-blown mania for since 2001. So what's that? It's 22 years I haven't had full-blown mania. And that's just from calling my psychiatrist early.
I'm really glad that you mentioned the hypersexuality, increased interest in sex or libido, because, you know, a lot of people are shy or a bit embarrassed about talking about that with their clinicians, or just describing that verbally as a thing that often comes hand in hand with bipolar disorder. So I really appreciate you just saying that, and that is one of your cardinal early warning signs. And it sounds like it's a very effective technique for you to watch for that individually. We know from research evidence that a lot of people with bipolar disorder, their early warning signs will actually be relatively consistent. So if you can spend some time identifying what your individual signs are and sort of monitor them and track them proactively over time, then that can be time well spent.
I agree. I'm so lucky. I'm really fortunate that I have that warning sign.
You want to take one of the questions that we had in the lead up to this event? I'll read it to you as it came in. This was a question that came in from a Reddit Ask Me Anything that we were holding, and it kind of speaks to one of the things you've been alluding to in our conversation today, which is around hope. So this person says, I feel like I'm behind in life because of all of these years of bipolar disorder. I feel like I'm not meant to have a normal life. I can't function at a high level. I wish I could have a lasting relationship and a full-time job like everybody else. How do you deal with all the lost years due to your bipolar disorder?
This one's a tough one. I'm not so sure the writer will like my answer either. I don't dwell on it. I can calculate that I've had 10 lost years, 5 very bad, the first 5, but the first 10 were very bad. And over those 10 years, I was prescribed 24 psychotropic medications, mostly at the front end. So that shows how unstable I was, that the psychiatrist kept trying different combinations. In those days, I was on cocktails of drugs. It wasn't unknown for me to be on 6 or 7 drugs at a time. And so those are lost years. And I just find that if I were to dwell on them, it would ruin the time that I have now.
Mm.
They're done. There's nothing I can do about them. And I very much try to live in the present because the past wasn't so great. And I don't know what the future holds. And so I live in the present. And I really feel it would take away from what I'm experiencing now. So I just don't dwell on the lost years. In terms of not being able to function at a high level, I certainly don't function at the level that I used to. And what I've done is I've tried to lower my expectations. And that's another way of being happy. I used to be a really huge overachiever. And so by lowering my expectations, then I find I'm more content. And an example of that would be when they're talking about work. I had a job that by the time I reached my mid 50s or early 50s, I was at the peak of my career, and I had a lot of people underneath me that I was managing, and it was very stressful. I remember I used to go into the bathroom and cry, and I just couldn't handle it. And then one day, and I wondered what I do. I wasn't working out. And then one day a posting came by. I'm a social worker, and a posting came by for a job in social work, and it was a lesser job. And it was at a salary of $10,000 less a year, which is a huge, huge deduction in salary. And I took it because I just wasn't functioning. And it was the best thing I could ever have done. I loved that job. There was less stress. I didn't have to apprehend children, which I always found a horrific thing to do. And I enjoyed it. And that was my final job. I stayed in that job until I finished working. And so I think that people have to be creative. If they can't work at their level or don't think they're working at their optimum level, or they can't do their job, I think they either have to do something like I did, get a lesser job, but I was still in my profession. At one point when I was suffering and struggling with the depression, I didn't have employment, and I worked in a cafe with the MSW to support my children. So I was really not functioning in the work world at all. So I lowered my expectations, and that made a big difference. And in terms of relationships, I systematically destroyed my marriage. And also the severe, profound depression I had when I was suicidal also destroyed my marriage. It just picked away at it until there was nothing left eventually. And so now I've been in a stable relationship for 12 years, common law. And the only reason I'm in that stable relationship is because I'm stable. And I wouldn't have been the same person if he had met me as I was then. I wouldn't have been able to maintain a relationship with him either. And so I had to work on my stability. It all gets back to working on stability. And what I would suggest to the writer is that there's so many things that they can avail themselves of nowadays. There are webinars, there's podcasts, there's quality of life tools, there's peer support work, support groups. I could go on and on. And the more that they avail themselves of these services, I think more stability they will have, and then they won't incur any more lost years. And when I was diagnosed in 1991, I was living in a town in England, and they had none of those things. So that's why my journey has been so solitary. There were no support groups. I had never even spoken to someone who had bipolar disorder. And so for me, it was a long journey. But I think if the person posing the question avails themselves of all these services, I just am so certain that their journey will be much, much shorter than mine was. And then, of course, they'll be well or stay living well with bipolar disorder, and they won't have lost years. I don't think the lost years are an absolute.
That was a really thoughtful response. Thank you. It makes me want to go back to where we started this conversation, because you talked about the way in which you received your diagnosis and the messaging around that, the way it was communicated, which is that this is a really severe chronic condition. In fact, our friends at the Spectrum Center in the UK have wrote a paper describing them as the bipolar misery statistics. If you just get a diagnosis of bipolar disorder and you Google it, you will come across the key messages around this is a chronic condition, suicide rates are high, cognitive problems are common, unemployment is common, marital loss or relationship problems. What message would you like to hear? Would you like to hear instead for people who are just recently diagnosed with the condition? What would you say to them?
I don't know. I'm trying to think. I would say to them that it is going to be a rocky ride. These things do happen. Everything that you've mentioned, I've had. I have the cognitive impairments. I've had job losses. I've been fired. It has been a rocky road. There's no doubt about it. But I think that if you get in the groove and if you do the work that has to be done, there's a fair amount of work to be done. When you read these blurbs on Google, they don't really talk about what you can do. All they say is you'll have this and you'll have that and this will happen to you, but they don't offer any solutions. So I think that if you look at it, and if you were to be just diagnosed today, and they didn't have the internet when I was diagnosed in 1991, I would have been flabbergasted. I would have just been devastated to read all those things that could happen. And also all those things don't happen to everyone. Those are all the things that can happen. And so take it with a grain of salt, live day by day, try and do the work that you do. And hopefully you'll come out on the other side like me.
Thank you, Louise. How are you feeling having spent this time talking together?
Oh, it's been great. I've been very nervous. I wish I hadn't been so nervous, but
you have not looked very nervous at all.
That's the generalized anxiety talking.
I just so enjoyed that. I have a feeling that people will want to hear and see more of these. So if you're willing in the future, we'd love to hear from listeners of this Talk BD event. If there are other topics you would like Louise to expand on, or for us, because I feel like we just sort of scraped the surface of your story and our time together. So I'd love to come back and pick up on some pieces of this, Louise, in the future, if you're game.
Well, I'm game for sure. Absolutely. Anything that I can do to help.
Yeah, and that's part of it, I gather as well through your writing, is this sort of altruism in terms of giving back to other people who are experiencing the condition in the mental health community more widely, and sharing some of the lessons that you've learned on the way. So we really appreciate your work in that area. And you, Louise, thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. See you next time.